Thomas Holt placed an advertisement for a ranch hand the way he did everything else in his life. Carefully, without sentiment, and with the quiet assumption that nobody would surprise him. He was wrong about that last part. I have come across a good many stories in my time, the kind that get passed around at kitchen tables and church basements, the kind that people tell in hushed voices because they still can't quite believe they happened. Most of them are about luck, or hardship, or both, but every now and then, you come across a story that is about something harder to name. Something like the particular stubbornness of two people, who were each convinced they had nothing left to learn, and the slow, inconvenient discovery that they were both mistaken. This is that kind of story. Thomas Holt had come to the Peace River country of northern Alberta in 1958 with a second-hand pickup truck, $400, and the bone-deep conviction that the land asked honest questions and gave honest answers, which was more than he could say for most people. By 1964 he had 320 acres of mixed farmland, a herd of 47 cattle, a barn that didn't leak unless the wind came from the northeast, and a silence around him so complete that his nearest neighbor, a widower named Peterson who lived 11 miles down the gravel road, had stopped checking on him after Thomas returned every visit with a cup of bad coffee and fewer than 15 words. Thomas was 41 years old. He was tall in the way that men who work outdoors become tall. Not elegantly, but practically, as though his body had arranged itself for function rather than appearance. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that were wider than they looked, and a face that had been weathered by Peace River winters into something that was not quite handsome but was thoroughly honest. He did not waste words. He did not waste motion. He believed that most problems in life could be solved by waking up earlier and talking less, and he had lived by this principle for long enough that he had begun to believe it was wisdom rather than habit. His wife, Janet, had died in the spring of 1961. 3 years and the land still had her in it somehow. In the kitchen garden she had planted along the south wall, in the curtains she had sewn for the windows that faced the road, in the particular way the evening light came through the porch and landed on the floor, in a shape he had never been able to make himself step on. He had not been looking for anyone. He wanted to be clear about that. What he had been looking for was someone who could help with the North Quarter, which had gotten away from him. The hayfields needed attention he didn't have time for. The fencing along the creek had gone to ruin over 2 wet springs, and his own knees, which he would not admit to anyone were giving him trouble, made the steep banks near the water harder than they had been. He placed the advertisement in the Grande Prairie newspaper in March of 1964. He listed the pay. He listed the tasks. He noted that the position included a room in the bunkhouse, that the work was physical and the hours were long, and that anyone who could not handle isolation should apply elsewhere. He received 7 replies. 6 of them were from men. The 7th was from a woman named Vivian Audet. Vivian Audet arrived on the 14th of April, which in the Peace River country is still winter by any reasonable definition, on a Greyhound bus that let her off at the crossroads 4 miles from Thomas's gate. She had arranged for him to collect her at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which he did, pulling up in the pickup to find her standing beside 2 canvas duffels and a wooden crate with ventilation holes, in a canvas jacket that was entirely appropriate for the weather and work boots that had clearly done work before. She was 36 years old. She was from the Beauce region of Quebec, French-Canadian by background and fiercely proud of it in the particular way of people who have moved far from home and found that distance clarifies what you value. She was medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of face that did not arrange itself into pleasantness for its own sake, but was capable of warmth when it chose to be. She had spent the previous 8 years working on a mixed operation outside Dawson Creek, and before that on her uncle's dairy farm in St. George. She could mend fence, calve a heifer, drive a tractor, and read a weather system by the color of the clouds over the northern hills, which in the Peace River country is a skill worth more than most formal education. Thomas pulled up, got out, looked at the crate with the ventilation holes and said, "What's in that?" Vivian said. "A dog." Thomas said, "I didn't advertise for a dog." Vivian said, "You advertised for help with the North Quarter, the creek fencing and the hay management. I can do all 3. The dog is not your concern." Thomas looked at her for a moment. He was a man who had made his decisions about people quickly and rarely revised them. He was already revising. He put the crate in the truck bed. He put the duffels in after it. He drove the 4 miles to the property in silence, which was his preference, and was not entirely surprised to find that Vivian Audet did not attempt to fill it. She looked out the window at the land, and whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself. When they reached the property, she got out of the truck, stood in the yard, and turned in a slow circle, taking in the barn, the bunkhouse, the north field visible over the fence line, the creek line in the distance marked by the bare willows. Then she said, "The drainage on the North Quarter is running the wrong direction. You're losing topsoil every spring." Thomas said, "I know." She said, "Do you have a plan for it?" He said, "I have a shovel." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. She said, "That's a start." He showed her the bunkhouse, which was clean, heated by a wood stove and furnished with a bed, a table, a chair, and a shelf that held 3 years of farmer's almanacs and a coffee can full of nails. She looked at the shelf and said, "I'll need another shelf." He said, "What for?" She said, "Books." He said, "There's a library in Peace River." She said, "Peace River is 40 miles away, I need a shelf." He did not build her a shelf immediately. He was a stubborn man, and the stubbornness was not meanness. It was the particular resistance of a person who had spent a long time arranging the world at exactly the distance he could manage, and who recognized, without quite admitting it, that Vivienne Audette was the kind of person who would not stay at that distance. He built her the shelf 3 days later. It was pine, plain smooth with 2 tiers and a small lip at the front edge that served no structural purpose at all. He left it outside the bunkhouse door without a word. When he came back past the window that evening, the shelf was on the wall, and there were books on it. The dog, he discovered, was named Fix, which was short for something in French that Vivienne did not translate. Fix was a border collie cross, black and white with 1 blue eye and 1 brown, and the focused, slightly unnerving intelligence of dogs who have spent their lives working. The morning after Vivienne arrived, Thomas came out to find Fix sitting at the edge of the yard, watching the cattle in the near field with an expression of professional interest. Thomas said, "Your dog is staring at my cattle." Vivienne, who was already in the yard, already in her work jacket, already holding a mug of coffee she had made herself in the bunkhouse, said, "He's reading them." Thomas said, "Reading them?" She said, "He's checking who's uneasy, who's off their feet, who's standing wrong. He does this every morning. It's useful." Thomas looked at the dog. Fix, without looking away from the cattle, sat up slightly, as though aware of being discussed and choosing to maintain professional composure. Thomas said nothing, but the next morning, before he went out to check the herd himself, he watched Fix's ears and watched where the dog's attention moved. And he found the heifer who was 3 days from calving and didn't yet know it herself. He did not tell Vivienne about this. She found out anyway. By the end of April, Vivienne had cleared 200 yards of creek fencing, replaced 30 posts, started the drainage correction on the north quarter using a grade system Thomas had not thought of and would not admit to admiring, and reorganized the hay storage in a way that would reduce spoilage by 1/3. She worked from first light until the light gave out. She did not complain. She did not ask for help unless she needed it. And when she needed it, she asked directly and without apology and got back to work the moment it was given. Thomas was unsettled by this in a way he could not articulate, because the unsettledness was not displeasure. He had expected to tolerate her presence the way you tolerate weather. Necessary, sometimes difficult, not personal. What he had not expected was that she was interesting, not charming, not warm, particularly, not in the easy way, but interesting. She had opinions about crop rotation and federal agricultural policy and the specific failures of the post-war settlement programs in northern Alberta, and she expressed these opinions the way she expressed everything, directly, without excessive decoration, and with the expectation that the person she was speaking to was capable of following the argument. Thomas was capable of following the argument. He was not, in general, a man who argued back, but he started to. The first real argument happened at the end of April, over the question of whether to pull the old fence line along the south pasture or repair it in place. Thomas wanted to repair. Vivienne wanted to pull and reset the whole run, which she said had heaved so badly over the freeze-thaw cycles, that fixing it piece by piece was like patching a coat that had rotted through. Thomas said, "Pulling means 3 days of work." Vivienne said, "Patching means the same 3 days spread across the next 4 years every time a section gives way." Thomas said, "I've been patching that fence since 1959. Vivienne said, "And how's that going?" Thomas looked at her. He was not a man who lost arguments often, because he was not usually presented with arguments that were correct. This one was correct. He knew it was correct before she finished the sentence. He stood there with the particular stillness of a person who was recalibrating. He said, "We'll start Monday." She said, "Good," that was all. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them spoke about it, which was the right decision. The low point came in the first week of June. It had been a wet spring, wetter than usual even for the Peace River country, and the creek came up higher than Thomas had seen it in 10 years. The new drainage work on the north quarter held. Vivienne's grade system moved the water correctly, out and away, and the field that had been soft in April was firm enough to walk by the second week of May. But the old crossing at the north end of the property, a timber bridge Thomas had built in 1962, did not hold. He found it on a Tuesday morning. 2 of the 4 main timbers cracked through. The decking sagged and dangerous. The cattle had already found the gap in the fence downstream and gone through it. 12 of them were on the wrong side of the creek in the lower bush, and the creek itself was too high and too fast to cross safely on foot. Thomas stood at the bank for a long time. The math was not good. Getting the cattle back meant either waiting for the water to drop, which would take 3 days, during which the cattle would range further into the bush, and potentially onto the crown land to the north, where he had no right to them. or it meant finding another way across, which meant 6 miles around to the highway bridge and back along the far bank, a full day on foot in wet grass with his knees the way they were. He had not told Vivienne about his knees. He did not hear her come up beside him. She was quiet that way. She and Fix both, they moved without announcing themselves. She stood at the bank and looked at the water, and then looked at the broken bridge, and then looked at the cattle visible through the willows on the far bank, and she said, "How long can we wait?" He said, "3 days if we push it. 2 if we don't," she said, "then we don't wait." She looked at him. "How are your knees?" he said. "My knees are fine," she said. "Thomas," he said. "Nothing," she said. "I've been watching you on the creek bank for 6 weeks. I know what fine looks like. That's not it." He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said, "They're not good on steep ground." She said, "Okay." She turned and went back toward the barn, and he stood there feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and then he followed her because there was nothing else to do. What she had figured out while he was standing at the bank calculating his own limitations was this. The timber from the demolished section of the old south fence, which they had pulled and stacked 2 weeks earlier, was long enough and dry enough and strong enough to span the narrowest point of the crossing if laid correctly. It would not be a bridge. It would be a temporary platform, enough to bring the cattle back across one at a time, with Fix working the far bank. If Thomas worked the near side from stable ground, and she worked the middle where the footing was uncertain, he said, "That's not safe," she said. "It's safer than 6 miles and a bad knee." He said, "You could go in," she said. "I can swim," he said. "In June snowmelt," she said. Thomas were burning daylight. They got the cattle across in 4 hours. Fix was extraordinary, quiet, precise, reading each animal's edge and working just inside it, never pushing hard enough to panic, never soft enough to fail. Vivienne was waist deep in the crossing for 20 minutes of those 4 hours, moving the timber guides, and Thomas, on the bank, steadied the leads and kept the cattle calm, with a patience that came from 30 years of knowing that animals, like weather, had to be managed on their own terms. When the last one was through, Vivienne climbed the bank and stood in the yard dripping with that particular expressionless dignity of a person who has done something difficult and is not going to make a production of it. Fix sat beside her, dry, looking pleased with himself. Thomas went into the house. He came back with a towel that was not new but was clean, and a blanket, and he put them on the fence post beside her. Without a word, then he went to make coffee. When she came inside, she was wearing dry clothes and she had Fix with her, which had not previously been permitted in the house. Thomas looked at the dog. He looked at Vivienne. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down. He said, "How did you know about the fence timber?" She said, "I've been looking at that stack for 2 weeks wondering what you were saving it for. When I saw the bridge I knew." He said, "You planned this," she said. "I planned for something going wrong. In the Peace River country in a wet June something always goes wrong." He said, "That's true." She wrapped her hands around the mug. Fix settled under the table. Outside the creek ran high and fast and the wet June light came through the kitchen window at the angle Janet's curtains had always framed, and Thomas sat across the table from Vivienne Audet and felt something move in him that he had not felt in 3 years. Not happiness, not exactly. Something older than happiness. The feeling of not being alone in the arithmetic of a difficult day. He did not say this. He said, "Good work today." She said, "You too." That was sufficient. What changed between them did not happen all at once. It happened the way the drainage work had happened. One grade at a time. Each cut directing the water a little more correctly than before. The whole thing only visible as a system when you step back far enough to see the shape of it. Thomas started leaving the kitchen light on in the evenings. This was practical. The yard between the house and the bunkhouse was uneven, and the light made the path easier to see. But the light also meant that when Vivienne looked up from her book, she could see the warm rectangle of the kitchen window, and she sometimes looked up at it, the way you look at something you have not named yet, but have already started to count on. Thomas fixed the northeast corner of the barn roof, which had been leaking since before Vivienne arrived, on a Saturday in July when she was in Peace River for supplies. He did this not because the leak was new, it had been on his list for 2 years, but because her side of the barn was directly under it. Vivienne made bread twice a week. She made enough for herself, and she left a loaf on the porch railing every second time without comment. Thomas ate the bread and left the cloth she wrapped it in, washed and folded, on the same railing by the next morning. They did not discuss this. In August, Vivienne's younger brother drove up from Edmonton for a weekend, a cheerful, loud man named Rémi, who talked enough for 3 people and seemed genuinely delighted by everything, including the landscape, the cattle, Fix's herding demonstrations, and Thomas's discomfort with company. He had been there for approximately 2 hours when he said, at dinner, looking between Thomas and his sister with the open book expression of someone who has already made up his mind, "So how long has this been going on?" Vivienne said, in French, something sharp and brief. Rémi said, in English presumably for Thomas's benefit, "I'm just saying what I see." Thomas said, "Pass the salt." But that night after Remy was in the bunkhouse, Vivian had taken the second bedroom in the house, a thing that had happened incrementally and without formal announcement over the course of July. Thomas sat on the porch in the dark and thought about what Remy had said. Not the words. The words were obvious. He thought about what it meant that the answer was not nothing, and that he was not, when he considered this honestly, troubled by that. He was 58 years old, no, 41. He kept forgetting he was still 41, which felt improbable given how long the last 3 years had seemed. He had not expected to build anything again. He had been, in the way of people who have survived a significant loss, protecting himself with distance the way you bank a fire against a cold night. Enough heat to survive, not enough to burn anything down. Vivian was the first person in 3 years who had made him feel that the banking might not be necessary. He did not know what to do with this. He was a man who knew what to do with most things. He went inside and went to sleep. The conversation that changed everything happened in September, on an evening when the light was going gold and thin, the way it does at the end of a Peace River summer, that particular slant that means the season is turning, and the work of preparation is beginning. They were sitting on the porch after supper, Fix at Vivian's feet, and they had been talking about the winter hay inventory, which was a practical conversation, and then they had stopped talking, which was comfortable, and then Vivian said, without looking at him, "I've been offered a position in the spring. Operation outside Fort Vermilion, more land, higher pay." Thomas said nothing for a moment. The evening light moved across the north field. He said, "Are you going to take it?" She said, "I haven't decided." He said, "What would help you decide?" She turned and looked at him then with that direct, undecorated attention she had given everything since April. The fence lines, the drainage, the cattle, the creek, and she said, "An honest answer to an honest question." He said, "All right," she said, "what am I to you, Thomas?" He was quiet for long enough that another person might have taken it for avoidance. But Vivian had learned by September that Thomas Holt's silences were not evasions. They were the sound of a man being careful with something that mattered. He said, "You're the first person in 3 years who's made this place feel like it makes sense again." He said it to the north field, not to her, in the way of a man who finds that the words are easier when they are not aimed directly. "I don't know what to call that. I know it's more than a ranch hand." She said, "It's more than that for me too." He said, "The Fort Vermilion job." She said, "I'm not going to Fort Vermilion, Thomas." He said, "I didn't ask you not to." She said, "I know. That's why I'm staying." They sat on the porch for another hour in the September dark, and Fix moved from Vivian's feet to lie across both their feet, which he had never done before, and which Thomas accepted without comment. There is a word in French, Vivian told him that winter, by the wood stove in the kitchen where Fix slept on an old quilt in the corner. The word is chez soi. It means something like, at home with oneself. But more than that, it means the feeling of being in exactly the place you are supposed to be, with exactly the people you are supposed to be with, which is rarer than it sounds, and more valuable than most of what people spend their time acquiring. Thomas said, "In English we say home, but that doesn't cover it." Vivian said, "No, it doesn't." Thomas said, "My wife used to say that this kitchen in the winter at this time of evening, she said it was the only place in the world where the size of the world felt right." Vivian said quietly, "I understand that." He said, "I know you do." That was the moment, not a declaration, not a ceremony. Just two people on either side of a wood stove in northern Alberta in December, with a border collie on a quilt and 32 years of separate histories between them. Recognizing something they had both stopped expecting to find, they were married the following June, in the yard of the property, by a United Church minister, who drove up from Peace River and stayed for lunch afterward, because Vivienne had made tourtière and butter tarts, and the minister was not a fool. The witnesses were Remy, who cried, and old Peterson from down the road, who did not cry but shook Thomas's hand for a long time, and didn't say anything, which from Peterson was equivalent. Fix sat beside Vivienne through the ceremony and accepted congratulations afterward from Remy, with the tolerant dignity of a professional, who has wandered into a personal occasion, and is making the best of it. Thomas and Vivian Holt farmed the Peace River property for 27 years. The drainage system Vivian designed in her first spring there is still in use. The north quarter, which had been going to waste when she arrived, became the most productive section of the land. The bookshelf in the bunkhouse, the pine one with the lip at the front that served no structural purpose, was moved into the house when the bunkhouse was converted to storage, and eventually it held not 2 tiers but 4, and ran the length of the living room wall. Thomas died in 1991 at the age of 68, in the hospital in Peace River, with Vivian beside him and Fix's granddaughter, a compact black and white dog named after a Quebecois river nobody in Alberta could pronounce, asleep at the foot of the bed in violation of about 4 hospital policies. Vivian lived until 2003. She was 75 years old. She is buried on the north quarter, where she asked to be, because she said she wanted to see the drainage work every spring, and she wanted whoever was farming the land after her to know it had been done right. She placed an advertisement for a ranch hand. He got a woman who rewrote the land under his feet and the silence inside his house, and quietly, without asking permission, the shape of everything he thought his life was still allowed to be. I think about that sometimes. About how much of what we protect ourselves from turns out to be exactly what we needed. About how the thing you didn't advertise for, the shelf, the bread on the railing, the dog across both your feet, is sometimes the thing that tells you you've stopped just surviving and started again. What was the moment for you? When you knew Thomas had stopped counting the days until she left,